And here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment for the Sony Xperia 5 Mark II. This phone launched in October of 2020 here in the US at $950 US. And even though it's expensive, it's still less expensive than the Xperia 1 Mark II, and more importantly, I think it actually has more to offer the majority of users. And I'll get to that through the course of this review. So let's talk about what you're getting in terms of specifications at $950. We have a 6.1-inch OLED display, roughly basically full HD based on its aspect ratio. The literal resolution is 1080 by 2520. Brightness is fairly solid. It's HDR capable, at least per Sony. And in addition to that, we've got stereo speakers. We have a Snapdragon 865 processor under the hood, complemented by 8 gigs of RAM, 128 gigs of storage, which, by the way, is expandable right here, and I'll be getting to that a little bit later because I do love this design of the SIM tray, something the Xperia 1 Mark II had as well. Basically, you do not need a tool, so that's fantastic. And part of the reason is that this is a Sony phone, and it is meant to reflect the fact that Sony right now is the king of the hill when it comes to digital imaging. So part of the good news with this is that you are getting the exact same camera system as the Xperia 1 Mark II. It doesn't have the exact same autofocus system, but the sensors and the actual lens assemblies and overall performance is right there. I did not really see any major difference between the autofocus on this phone and the Xperia 1 Mark II, even though the 1 Mark II has a more complex autofocus system. Another thing that this phone has that the Xperia 1 Mark II doesn't is the ability to capture 4K video at 120 frames per second. So I'm not aware of any other phone that has that capability, and interestingly enough, this did launch right around the same time as the A7S Mark III that also is famous for its 4K 120 frame per second capability. So really impressive to have that in this $950 phone. So when it comes to cameras, they've pretty much, in my opinion, hit it out of the park. Some users will favor over-processing and things that this phone doesn't do, much like the Xperia 1 Mark II doesn't do those things. But I think they really have hit the nail on the head when it comes to a DI perspective. You still get the Cinema Pro app, which is where you will actually find the 4K 120 frame per second option. You can see it will be captured or finalized at 24 frames and no audio capability, just so you're aware of that. And you still get all the niceties like the Xperia 1 Mark II when it comes to the look, whether you want Venice. I mean, these are all the options you would expect out of a cinema camera, and yet they live here in a $950 phone. And while some may think this is a gimmick, I would argue this is the beginning of Sony really making their mark in the smartphone business, something that Sony as a brand should really own, but yet kind of sat on their hands and had a lot of swings and misses here, at least in the US. So I'm glad to say this is the second phone I'm reviewing from Sony. I would have liked to have said in 2020, but this review unit came fairly late. So I was not able to give this review to all of you in 2020, but it was a product of 2020, and between it and the Xperia 1 Mark II, I think Sony is emerging now as one of the best manufacturers out there, as they should be in the smartphone business. Beyond this app giving you the look and feel of a cinema camera, you can see it actually will create a project. It shows you, it's right now an HLG. It gives you your codec. It gives you your remaining internal storage, your audio levels. I mean, everything that you could possibly want. Is this for everyone? No, absolutely not. But if you're a Sony user, having access to it is going to be something you really enjoy. The same can be said of the Photo Pro app. You know, the ability to jump into essentially a mode dial, just like the Xperia 1 Mark II, and have everything at your fingertips in terms of manual control you could possibly desire is just something that you're not going to find on most phones. Now, don't get me wrong, other manufacturers such as Samsung have introduced Pro apps for their camera, but the likelihood that users are running after that on a Samsung device, I think, is far less than it would be on something like a Sony phone that is clearly being branded as a companion to Sony digital imaging users like myself and many of you out there. Now, you can go with the regular photo app if you want to. So those of you who are intimidated or just aren't interested in the amount of options presented to you, you just want point and shoot, you still have it, of course, with the traditional Android camera app. So that's part of the beauty of this phone, is that you aren't stuck inside the Pro apps if you don't want them. But remember, if you want to shoot that 4K slow motion, 120 frames per second, you will need to use the Pro Cinema app. So just be aware of that. The other nice thing about this phone is that it does have a dedicated shutter button. You hold it down for 2 seconds, more like a second and a half, and you're in the camera app. And of course, easily shooting. And this does still have eye autofocus, just like the Xperia 1 Mark II. So really, the experience, not to be cute, is virtually the same as the Xperia 1 Mark II. It just doesn't have the literal identical autofocus system. But again, I've seen no marked difference between this and the 1 Mark II. The selfie camera, I think, is the biggest letdown, just like the Xperia 1 Mark II. It just doesn't have the quality that most flagship devices have. So considering Sony is so DI focused, I wish that they really would give us a higher quality front-facing camera. I would say I'm nitpicking, but I'm not. We're now in 2021. And it's time, if Sony is going to really capture a large audience in the US and around the world, selfie cameras, even though they're not the most important thing to me, I can't justify them not having a better camera than the one that's on here. Now, if you're wondering about megapixels, because I haven't really talked a lot about them, Sony is not in that game. They realize, and I think they think their customers realize, that Samsung calling their sensors 64 megapixels or over 100 megapixels is ridiculous. Now, I'm not saying they don't literally contain that many megapixels, but sensor size is clearly the more important goal to achieve here for dynamic range and the actual ability to utilize those megapixels, whereas stuffing them into a tiny sensor really is just a marketing gimmick. So they're not playing the megapixel war here because it's a stupid one. Camera manufacturers learned that many years ago. So we're getting 12 megapixels across all 3 sensors, just like the Xperia 1 Mark II, and 8 on the front. And that's where I feel like users are going to say, well, this phone's got all the specs I would want, even 5G capable in some markets, but then it falls short on that front-facing camera. So, that's going to be a matter of personal preference, but to compensate, as I've stated, you are getting 4K 120 frame per second video capture that you won't find anywhere else, even on the more expensive 4K displayed Xperia 1 Mark II. So, take that with a grain of salt. Now, in terms of the physical build, it's a really clean handset that Sony opted for rounded edges rather than the corners that we got with the Xperia 1 Mark II. We still have a headphone jack, which I think many of you appreciate for obvious reasons. On the right side of the device, a little bit strange. I will admit that here at 8.5 minutes in, when I first saw this, I was kind of scratching my head. You've got a volume rocker, a fingerprint scanner / power button. It doubles as both. Then you have a Google Assistant button right there dedicated. So if we hit that, we're prompted with the Google Assistant. And then we have the camera shutter button. Now, it's admittedly strange, but I think this is really a matter of personal preference. While I've yet to see a phone have 4 buttons on one side of it to this point, in my personal experience, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. I do actually like having a dedicated button for the Google Assistant. Do I think everybody's going to want it? No, I don't. But it's still nice to have, so I can't really knock it. It's just a little bit bizarre from a design perspective. On the bottom, of course, your Type-C port for charging, which tops out at 18 watts. That means it's going to take you a little over an hour to charge the 4,000 milliamp hour battery inside of this. The good news is that while I could have told you, or I would have thought 2 years ago, if you would have told me that this was only going to be 18 watts, I would have said that's not very fast. Samsung did take a step backwards with quick charging this year. My Note 20 Ultra, for example, did not take out the Note 10 Plus. In other words, the Note 10 Plus was capable of faster charging than the Note 20 Ultra. So for some odd reason, blame it on the pandemic, I guess, Samsung decided to take a step backwards in terms of quick charge capability. Many other manufacturers continuing to push forward and giving us new standards in rapid charging that we'll probably see sometime this year in 2021 or 2022. But for whatever reason, they took a step backwards. And that, as a result, gives me the ability to say, you know, I'm not going to really give it to Sony on this. Now, had Samsung and other manufacturers, Apple's one of them, really pushed the envelope with quick charging, then I would be saying this is a glaringly obvious problem. But it's not, because other manufacturers, mainstream, large ones, have not really pushed the envelope in 2020, even though we're now in 2021 by all of a few days. So I can't really give Sony too much grief over the 18 watts. And, you know, still to charge up your phone in a little over an hour isn't that far from much of the flagship competition. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, this is one of my favorite elements of the Xperia 1 Mark II and the Xperia 5 Mark II that we're looking at here, which is the toolless design. You will need a little bit of a nail, which I barely have any, but I'm still able to get it. And you can see I've already opened up the dual tray for your SIM card and micro SD card. So, storage expansion is a go here. I've tested it with my 1 terabyte micro SD card, no problems. And the beauty of this is that if you're using this the way Sony intends, which is really as a camera, that's why it has the Pro apps, you have quick access to your storage so that you don't have to rely on the Type-C port to transfer your images or some wireless protocol. You're just going to pop out the SIM tray and take out your SD card and review your images, transfer them, do whatever you need to. So I really like that. We still have IP68 rating on this, so dust and water resistance. This, of course, can get wet. It's wrapped in Gorilla Glass 6, so they did not spare an expense when it comes to what sort of glass they're using. Talking, you know, about that, you could look at someone like Apple, who I don't know if they've ever used Gorilla Glass. At any rate, the whole premise here is, again, to live up to their digital imaging prowess, and I think it's really smart that they do that. I wish more manufacturers would. So even though this is toolless, you can still submerge this in water for up to 30 minutes. Of course, don't go too deep. No IP68 rating supports, what is it, greater than, what is it, it's not 3 meters. At any rate, this really, in my opinion, no phone should be submerged in water if it doesn't have to be. You know, the idea is that it's there to protect the phone. It's not meant to be a calling card to submerge this in water all the time. So don't confuse the two, okay? But overall, really nice design in my opinion. Some will prefer this design over the sharp edges. I actually like the design of the Xperia 1 Mark II more, but with that in mind, I still am starting to think, over the 2 weeks I spent with this is the better phone overall, because that refresh rate, it really does make a difference, especially when most modern flagship phones do have 120 hertz refresh rates. God knows they'll probably even start to push out more. And then in addition to that, with Sony's Game Enhancer software, you can actually simulate higher refresh rates. And if you're not familiar with the Game Enhancer software, it's pretty unique because it basically allows you to prioritize processor performance, overall capability for the game you're playing. Now, some manufacturers have similar concepts to this, but I don't think anyone does it better than Sony. So considering Sony's not as mainstream, as large a player in the handset business, and yet they've figured, in my opinion, figured it out at a better level than the majority of the competition, says a lot about what they've done here. The multi-window switch is nice. I don't think a lot of users will really look at this phone and say, you know, Sony's put amazing touches on the software. In fact, the beauty of the Xperia line, both the 1 Mark II and here the 5 Mark II, is that this is as close to a Pixel, that is a stock Android experience, as you're going to get, which is a great thing for performance. And battery life here, I had no problems going all day. So considering this is a 4,000 milliamp hour battery, the slightly, you know, not slightly, but the lower resolution on this display, even with the 120 hertz refresh rate, That's another really nice thing about this. Battery life is better than what you get with the Xperia 1 Mark II. So you're spending less, you're getting a higher refresh rate, you're getting better battery life, yes, at the expense of the resolution, but then throw in the 4K 120 frame rate video recording, and this phone is really unique. The stereo speakers do not disappoint. Call quality was excellent, but I kind of expected that. And overall, I just think that Sony's done it again. You know, they made this more affordable. By the way, screen brightness is not all the way up. If I do take it all the way up, it's going to get blown out. So even though I was saying this doesn't get as bright as something like the Note 20 Ultra, most phones don't. So, you know, that's something you have to be realistic about. Wi-Fi performance on this is great. No issues with that. Bluetooth, no issues there either. But remember, you have a dedicated true 3.5 millimeter audio jack. So if you're really interested in audio quality, that's the route to go. You don't want to screw around with wireless connections. We've been forced to by manufacturers because, well, they don't have headphone jacks anymore. You can thank Apple for that, and then now Samsung followed suit as well, of course. In fact, I have the last device that Samsung, last Note, that they made with a headphone jack right here, the good old Note 9. And just for a side-by-side, so you can see hand-holding capability, I do think that the Xperia is a more palm-friendly device, no question about it. So if you're trying to figure out whether or not you're going to be happy with something like the Xperia, be aware that there are very few devices like this, meaning a large format display. Granted, the aspect ratio lends itself to a more narrow field of view. It's a longer device than most, but it really delivers everything other than pen input that anyone could ever want. It's got solid internal storage that is expandable. It's got the right amount of RAM. I mean, would I like to see more? I'm used to, 12 gigs of RAM because ever since the Note 10 Plus, and of course, my Galaxy Z Fold 2 right now as well, I haven't had 8 gigs of RAM, well, since the Z Flip, which is also a great phone, but a lot more expensive, and it's a folding phone at that. But when it comes to the processor, the display, the RAM, expandable storage, IP68 rating, this phone has it all except for wireless charging. I mean, that's really where I think it falls short. And if that's my biggest critique, I mean, Apple users have only had wireless charging now for, a few generations. So realistically speaking, Sony has done pretty much almost everything right with this phone. I think that pricing is on point. The cameras, as you already know, from what I've stated through the course of this review, are very good. So where does it fall short? I mean, I already mentioned the 18 watts here, which I think a lot of people will point out. I think some people will say that, the 4 buttons they don't like, but I really think that's going to be a matter of personal preference. The fingerprint scanner is perfectly fine. It's on par with the competition. I didn't experience any issues with that. And at the end of the day, the only thing that could have really screwed things up would be battery life, and it's solid. So the biggest shortcomings, to sum things up here, the front-facing camera, just like on the Xperia 1 Mark II, it shares that in common. After all, it has all of the same cameras. Remember, the autofocus system is the only thing that's different, and I couldn't tell a real difference because autofocus still locks in very quickly. And beyond that, you're really getting more features than the Xperia 1 Mark II has. The one thing the Xperia 1 Mark II has that this doesn't, again, is that 4K OLED display, which is an amazing thing to look at and experience. But certainly there are many people out there who are going to say, I don't need a 4K display in my pocket. Another thing you've got to remember is that inside of the settings, you've got a very stock look and feel. But then if you really dig in there, you are going to find things that don't exist with other manufacturers. So let me take down the brightness. So one example is the Dolby Atmos sound. I do recommend using it. It's going to make things louder. The soundstage is more dynamic, for lack of a better way of putting it. Another thing you want to be aware of when you jump into settings is that, when you look at the display, you have the ability to adjust white balance, which is really nice. And of course, you can go back to 60 hertz if you really want to max out the battery, but I don't recommend doing so. The other thing to know is that inside of the image quality settings, Just like the Xperia 1 Mark II, you do have access to the creator mode, which is very cool, but certainly not needed for the majority of people, which means you can get a true 10-bit reproduction here on this phone. So when it comes to color accuracy, you know, Sony's not going to make any, they're not going to take issue with having a color accurate display on a phone. In fact, when I go back to laptops and what Sony was known for, at least Vio was known for, it's no longer part of Sony, but going back to some of my favorite machines from them, they were all about color accuracy. Even when they were, of course, part of the Sony brand, some of you that can remember that far back will know exactly what I was talking about. I mean, their digital studio laptops were all about having color accurate displays. And now that they've got OLED technology, well, they don't really have to try very hard because OLED brings color accuracy to you pretty much no matter what. So you've got that creator mode, which is cool. I've left it in auto creator mode, which is how it comes out of the box. They also have their video image enhancement, which, you know, is a nice add-on. And this is really part of what Sony does right with their OLED-based devices and televisions. You know, when you buy an OLED TV from Sony, it's an LG panel, but the processing and ultimate final product, the reason you're paying more for it isn't just because Sony slapped their name on it. It's because they've done fine-tuning that LG doesn't bother to do. It's not a gimmick, it's real. Go and take a look. Well, we're in a pandemic. When we're not in a pandemic, or once you've had a vaccine, take a look at, if you haven't already, at what a Sony OLED looks like versus an LG, and you'll see the difference. Now, whether or not that will warrant you wanting to spend more money, different story entirely, but at the end of the day, there is a reason you're paying more for the Sony, and as I stated, it's not just because of the name. So, do I think this is worth buying? Now, for me personally, it's hard for me to look at phones that don't have wireless charging. And that may be a non-issue for the majority of you out there. It probably is, especially since so many people own iPhones that don't support wireless charging because, again, only a few generations have supported it, whereas Qi charging has been around. Oh, I feel like it's... my first phone with Qi charging, I think, was an HTC. That tells you how long Qi charging has been standard now. And across most Android phones, it is. So that really is my biggest nitpick with it. Beyond that, I can't really complain about much. Again, cameras are right there, processing power is there, battery life is there. You've got the 120 hertz, so if you were concerned about that, you don't need to be. The game enhancer on the software side is really nice if you do play games. It will give you an experience that ultimately is better than the majority of handsets, and it should. I mean, this is Sony, after all. Come on, PlayStation. Do I really need to say more? I mean, if Microsoft was in the handset business, and I don't mean the Duo that I reviewed, but I mean if they had any true footprint, they would be another manufacturer you'd expect to deliver a better gaming experience because of their console business. But Sony, being the true godfather of gaming, their phones do have a higher level of capability or expectation to live up to, just like they do with digital imaging now that they're at the top of that hill. So I think they deliver, and that's really important if you're trying to differentiate a product but still keep things as stock as you possibly can. I actually, as I stated, like the fact that we have that dedicated Google Assistant button. A lot of you aren't going to care for it. In fact, I think a lot of people will look at this and say it just looks like a mess. They didn't try. I think it's good. I really do. It may not be the prettiest look. It may be harder to mount this phone on a phone holder for using it as a dedicated camera. But I think overall, this is one of the best smartphones on the market. Could they have made the charging via hardwire Type-C faster? Sure. Did they need to this year? No. I've already said that through the course of this video. They were able to get away with it. And the fact that you're getting a higher refresh rate display that is a little bit smaller, I think is going to be preferable for the majority of users out there. It's at a lower price than the Xperia 1 Mark II. You're getting the exact same sensor lens pairings with Zeiss Star coating, T-Star coating. The flash is, well, a flash on a mobile phone, so don't get too excited about that. The Gorilla Glass wrap is great. But from a fingerprint standpoint, it is gross. I mean, I know it's coming across in this video. It looks like a mess, but that's what you get with a glossy black finish, a mirrored black finish on any device. The phone is made in Thailand, if you missed the sticker right there on the back. Not made in China, for those of you that matters to. And just overall, it's a really good phone with a Pixel-esque feel, but much better features in many areas. So if you've been waiting for Sony to come out with a more affordable, more well-rounded, both figuratively and literally, device than the Xperia 1 Mark II, I think you're looking at it. And granted, I've only spent a couple weeks with it. I can still say here at the beginning of 2021 that this is one of the best phones on the market. Again, great cameras, great battery life, 4K 120 frames per second. You won't find anywhere else. And by the way, there is electronic image stabilization. Not that that's shocking. It's a phone. And it's solid. It's not as good as the Xperia 1 Mark II in that department. I would say that's the only defining true difference that I experienced firsthand, was that the electronic stabilization for shooting video on the Xperia 1 Mark II was a little bit better. But if that's the biggest difference, this phone pretty much wins in every way, shape, and form. I mean, I would rather have the 4K 120 frames per second. I even like, as I've stated over and over again, having the digital assistant button. I use Google Assistant more than I'd like to admit, and having a physical button is not a bad thing, because then you can turn off the keyword and, hit a button, which may not sound intuitive, but there are a few reasons that you'd want to do that. So at the end of the day, the biggest letdown with this phone really is the selfie camera, in my opinion, which I don't even care that much about, but I still have to tell all of you because I know a lot of you will care about it. And then the fact that we have a beautiful display, solid processor, it's not the 865 Plus like I have in my Z Fold over here, but look at that size difference. Of course, this is half the price of the Z Fold. It's actually less than half the price. And there isn't a huge difference in processing capability. I mean, the 865 Plus over the 865, it's a step. But, would I've liked to have seen Sony give us the 865 Plus? Sure, I would have. But again, I'm looking at this as a first step for Sony to getting their chops back in the smartphone realm. And both the Xperia 1 Mark II and this phone prove to me, and it should to most of you out there who are interested, that Sony means business, because they've produced two phones that, even if it's not for you, anyone could happily take, use, and enjoy. And I can't say that of, unfortunately, the lineage of Xperia handsets, particularly that launched here in the US or didn't launch, especially if you were a Verizon customer like myself. You literally had no options when it came to Xperia phones. Now we do have options. Granted, no 5G with them, but I don't even live in a 5G market anyway. So that pretty much wraps it up. I mean, kudos to Sony for opening the door back to premium handsets that deserve glowing reviews because, well, they pretty much almost have the best of everything. So I'm really excited about Sony's future in this space, and I can't wait to see what they have coming next. I mean, CES is right around the corner. Hopefully we'll see some new things from them, even if it's virtually. I have high expectations for what Sony's going to do, and hopefully Sony will bring us a tablet as well in the future. I mean, these are just some, final thoughts, but I'd like to see some more competition beyond Apple and Samsung when it comes to high quality tablets. So much like they're now giving us another option in the phone realm, even if they haven't made the phone I want yet personally, because I do love my Z Fold 2 and no one else makes a phone that compares with that. That is my daily driver. I love that thing to death. It's the best of both worlds. If I was still only interested in a candy bar style phone, you better believe that this and the Xperia 1 Mark II are right up there. And again, with this being the more affordable and overall more functional device than the Xperia 1 Mark II for the majority of users who don't care about the 4K display, Sony's hitting it out of the park, especially with the stereo audio, which I couldn't have done justice with in this video. At any rate, hope you enjoyed the review. 29 minutes in, you will not be disappointed with this phone. It is premium all around, and it is worth its asking price, and it will only go down in price over time. I guarantee that. But that pretty much rounds it out. Great phone, again, kudos to Sony for making something that I can recommend in the smartphone realm. That is just not something I could say for the last 10 years. But 2020, well, that was the beginning for, again, the most premium manufacturer, in my opinion, in the business that for some odd reason just quit on phones. But the good news is they're back at it. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe and please stay safe. Later.